All right.
And you can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me, Dana. I'm so excited to be able to talk about bats and especially living at their thermal limits, both looking at their behavior and physiology. In both the extreme and cold and the extreme hot, bats have such cool physiological and behavioral adaptations. So it's really cool to be able to talk about it. I do just want to do a quick content note that some slides might contain imagery of either sick or deceased bats. So just a quick warning about it. Most of the pictures are later on, but just so you're aware ahead of time. But just to give you guys a quick idea of what my research had focused on previously, during my undergrad here at Craig Willis's lab at the University of Winnipeg, my undergrad thesis focused on the pre-hibernation foraging behavior of little brown bats. I actually published this in the journal, the Canadian Journal of Zoology, which I noticed is here. We have a representative, so it's a very cool full circle moment. And then I also worked on a side project on the stress-induced body temperature changes of silver-haired bats, so a migratory species here in Canada. And then for my master's, I switched it up a little bit, and I studied a third species of bats in Canada. And I looked at the hibernation behavior and physiology of big brown bats, and specifically how they're able to be resistant to a fungal disease called white nose syndrome. So all very interesting projects that I've been able to work on and kind of pull from. And some of the topics that I talk about today did touch or does touch on my previous research. But you do just want to start by talking about kind of the habitat first. Around the world, we have different habitat types, and the habitat is the physical conditions and also the land cover and climate that will enable species to persist over time. There's different ways that we can delimit a species habitat, and the IUCN does broadly list 16 categories, with some of the most prominent ones shown here, kind of across the global map. And there's a few prominent ones that you can see right away. So we have ones like the one in green, which is forest, which contributes to about 27% of the total habitat types. But we have other ones like deserts as well, which contributes to about 18%, mostly around the equator as well. And then other things like artificial land, which includes arable land, pasture land, and also urban areas as well. And these are habitats that bats will face and other species as well. But if we look at a global map of bat species richness, kind of overlaid the habitat types. So in dark red will be the most or the highest species richness of bats. And then kind of ranging down to the white, which is essentially zero. Most bats do occur around the equator, but all bats will face different extreme temperatures within their habitat. And they're going to need different physiological and behavioral adaptations in order to survive these extreme temperatures. But there's so much that we don't know and so many species that we haven't even discovered yet. And the species number is consistently changing, and we do now keep records of these different species on a database set up by Nancy Simmons and Andrea Cintronello. And as of this morning, I went and checked it very quickly. There's 1,511 bat species. So quite numerous. They account for about 25% of all different species, but more are being discovered literally every year. This number is consistently going up, and there's so much that we don't know about bats. But they're all across the world, and they have to have different physiological and behavioral adaptations in order to face these extreme temperatures. So the way I set up this talk for today, I'll be first talking about bats living in the extreme cold. So two different methods, both hibernation and migration. And then I'm going to switch it up to bats living in the extreme heat and different kind of behavioral adaptations that they use in order to live in those extreme temperatures. So first, I'm going to talk about bats living in the extreme cold and specifically hibernation, which is what a lot of my research focused on throughout my degrees. But hibernation is a strategy used out quite widespread in the world. Hibernators are globally distributed, so they do occur in the temperate North America, but also Europe and temperate Eurasia. And then we also have hibernating bats in East Asia, so countries like China, Japan, and Mongolia. Now, hibernation is a strategy that occurs mostly during the cold winters, but it is also a strategy that bats will use when their insect prey disappears seasonally. And it also is a strategy that bats will use when they have different caves or mines available that provide stable microclimates. Now, stable microclimates include both a stable temperature and also a stable humidity as well, because the humidity is very important for hibernating bats. They mostly hibernate in humid conditions, and then stable temperatures, usually around 8 degrees centigrade. Now, we can study bats in hibernation, but one big thing that we look at is their body temperature during hibernation. And one method that we use is something called a temperature-sensitive data loggers. We also just call these eye buttons. When we order them from the company, they're about 3 to 3.5 grams and about 17.4 millimeters in diameter, which if you want to think about the size, this is about the weight of 2 Canadian dimes, about the diameter of the dime as well. These are a little bit heavy for bats though, so what we can do is we can actually modify these eye buttons by removing that metal casing. And then we can wrap them. And then what we do is we actually glue them to the bats' backs. We use a surgical adhesive, which is completely safe for the bats. At this point, the eye buttons are quite light, so it's not going to impair the bats during hibernation. So 1.5 grams isn't too big for them. And then these eye buttons will essentially measure their body temperature throughout hibernation, and it measures it at a frequency or at a interval that the researcher sets. So for example, for my studies, I usually set it at 5 minutes. So it takes a measurement of the bat's body temperature once every 5 minutes. The eye buttons do have to be retrieved though in order for the researcher to download the data. So we'll go and detach the eye buttons and then download the data. But then we'll get a skin temperature reading throughout all of hibernation. So what we can see on a skin temperature graph, if we look at the x-axis, this would be days into hibernation. Y-axis would be the body temperature of the bat. And what a normal bat does during hibernation is they'll have these periods of torpor. These periods of torpor right here is when the bat's body temperature is reduced, normally to about 1 to 2 degrees of the ambient temperature, so normally around 8 degrees. Bats also at the same time will decrease their heart and respiration rate. So they're breathing only once every few minutes, and their heart rate is incredibly slow as well. These combined will lower their metabolic rate, so they're not burning much energy at this point. They're decreasing the amount of energy they burn by up to 99%. So they're saving a lot of energy by using these bouts of torpor of the very low body temperature and then heart and respiration rate. Bats cannot stay in torpor though. They'll end up having these periodic arousals where they'll increase their body temperature back up to normal levels, and they'll also increase their heart and respiration rate. Now, we don't really know exactly why bats do arousals and other hibernators as well, but there's a few different hypotheses, including things like repaying sleep deficits in order to pee as well. Also to provide opportunities possibly to go and drink. That's kind of the leading hypothesis that losing water to the environment is kind of the main driver of arousals. But there's still research ongoing into figuring out into why these arousals occur, but they are very normal for a bat to go through these arousals. The arousals are very energetically expensive though. Most of the energy spent during hibernation is on these arousals, so they need to do it very infrequently because they don't want to burn through their fat reserves that they generate before hibernation. So they have to essentially kind of budget the energy they're burning on these very, very energetically expensive arousals. Now, hibernation does unfortunately come with a consequence for our North American bats. There is a disease currently in North America called white nose syndrome. This is a disease that does affect the hibernating species only, and it was brought over from Europe, very unfortunately. So white nose syndrome is a fungal disease, specifically in hibernating cave roosting bats. Right now, it is currently affecting 13 bat species in North America, and it is causing the fastest mammalian decline, with some populations having about a 90 to 90% mortality rate. The disease was originally found in Europe. However, there it doesn't cause significant population declines just because bats have evolved throughout the kind of millennial with the fungus. But the fungus was introduced to North America by humans and unfortunately causing this huge mortality rate. So these are pictures with or of bats with the fungus. It kind of grows on their face and on their wings as well. And this is a bat that unfortunately had died from it. And then this is a bat that has very severe lesions caused by the fungus on its wing and tail membranes. So it is a very sad disease. The fungus is called Pseudogymnoascus destructicans, and it is spread through direct contact. So either from bat to bat or bat with the cave walls as well. It is a fungus that grows very optimally in both cold and humid conditions, which unfortunately is the conditions that bats also hibernate in. So bats will choose cold conditions, normally about 8 degrees, and also humid conditions, so up to 99% relative humidity. And these are perfect conditions for the fungus to grow. So that's why the fungus is so successful in unfortunately killing bats. Now, what the fungus does, to give you an idea, this is going to be a healthy bat's wing, no fungus growing. So if we look at it under cross-section, we see a very clean, very thin, there's no fungal lesions, it's a very healthy wing. But this is going to be a bat with white nose syndrome. So this is under UV light to visualize the fungus growing, essentially the fungal lesions. And then if we look under cross-section, we can see these fungal lesions. There's thickening of the membranes, and it's essentially disrupting any type of gas exchange. And it's also making the bats lose more water to the environment. So bats are going to become dehydrated as the disease progresses throughout hibernation. The disease or the fungus is also going to cause the bats to have more frequent arousals too, which I'll show you what it looks like under the skin temperature graphs. So this is a healthy bat with the normal torpor bouts and then the normal amount of arousals that I showed on a previous slide. But with a bat with white nose syndrome, as hibernation kind of progresses and the fungus grows into their wing membranes, the bats are going to have more arousals more frequently. And so they're burning through more fat reserves. They're going to use up all of their fat before the end of hibernation. And unfortunately, they're going to starve to death. So between the bats losing a lot of water and burning through all their energy and their fat reserves, that's how bats unfortunately die from this disease. And it is a consequence of essentially hibernation. The fungus is making the growing very best in those conditions. And that's why bats are dying from it, unfortunately. There is a lot of work right now from researchers in North America and also other countries kind of looking into management options, different ways to essentially cure the disease. But unfortunately, it is spreading throughout North America and kind of decimating our bat populations as well. Now, I do just kind of want to change gears a little bit and talk about bats living in the extreme cold, specifically looking at migration. So bats who hibernate will stay kind of regionally and kind of tough out the conditions, but some choose to essentially leave the cold and go to much warmer locations. Now, one way that we can track the migration of different bats is to use MODIS tags. Now, MODIS is an international collaborative research network. It is set up by Birds Canada in partnership with different researchers and organizations. Now, MODIS is not specifically for bats, but it is also used to track birds and also insects, so ones like the monarch butterflies. Um, it is a very widespread network. As of kind of this month, May 2026, there's about 2,400 stations across the world. This represents 34 different countries and almost coming up to 500 different types of species tagged. And we're looking at almost 64,000 animals tagged. And once they're tagged, they can be detected by different stations kind of across the world in order to track their migration. Now, MODIS does use automated radio telemetry to track the movement of animals. So people will set up different stations kind of across the countries, and these are the tags that will be attached to different mammals. There is different makes and models of the tags, but for bats specifically, they are adhered to the bat's back. This is either by the surgical glue, or in some cases, they can also be sutured into the bat as well, or onto the bat's back very safely using anesthesia. The tags, the lifespan does vary depending on the model. It can be from about 20 days to infinity, kind of depending on the model. And the size does vary greatly as well, anything as small as 0.2 grams up to about 2.6. They are small enough to use on different insects as well, so they are quite versatile. And this is just an example of a different researcher. This is from Kristen Dreyer, who tagged Mexican free-tailed bats. So we can see kind of the tag on the bat's back. I'll restart that. The tag on the bat's back. And they can just be released and they're free ranging essentially. And this is how we can track their movement. So that tag is giving off radio frequencies in order to be picked up by the different stations. Now, this is an example of a study that did study Mexican free-tailed bats, and they were able to deploy a lot of different tags and kind of track where these bats were going. And the Mexican free-tailed bats were essentially able to travel distances of over 1,800 kilometers. So they were wintering in southern Mexico, but in the summer, they were coming up to northern Mexico and southwestern USA. For their summer breeding locations. And so the researchers essentially were able to determine where the bats were and their migration routes just through the MODIS tags and the MODIS towers. And they were able to estimate the numbers of migrating bats too. So very cool example of what people can do with these MODIS tags. But we can also, through MODIS tags, look at different behavior during migration. And the silver-haired bats are a great example of what we can discover using MODIS tags. So there's a study by McGuire and colleagues, and also Johannesson and Guglielmo, that looked at silver-haired bats. And in both studies, they discovered that bats can travel about 250 to 275 kilometers a day, which is an insane amount to be traveling. But silver-haired bats can travel about 1,500 kilometers without stopping and refueling, which is such a far distance and so cool. They can just fly continuously. What they did find, though, is that some silver-haired bats, though, will stop at different locations to feed, and this is essentially to refuel for the migration. And they can stop for about 11 to 21 days. During this time, too, some of these silver-haired bats might also use torpor, so that exactly what hibernating bats do, but they'll use it on the short term. And this is just to ensure that silver-haired bats can kind of stop and save some energy as well. So another example of what we can discover with MODIS tags. Migrating bats unfortunately do face consequences though. And one big kind of threat to migrating bats is wind turbines. And researchers have found that there is very high fatality rates at wind energy facilities. And these fatalities of migrating bats are highest during the autumn migration specifically, and also on nights with low wind speeds. In North America specifically, there's three mainly impacted species. Sorry, there's the hoary bat, the eastern red bat, and the silver-haired bat. The hoary bat, very unfortunately, is facing very rapid and severe population declines because of these wind turbines. Now, what happens is during migration, so bats will essentially collide with the wind turbine blades, and this is how they're essentially dying from it. So it is very unfortunate and very sad. But there is some solutions that have been proposed. One main one is curtailment of the wind turbines. So this is temporarily stopping or slowing the turbines, either at low wind nights or at peak migration periods. So this is either at the late summer or the fall. Another solution that's been proposed is acoustic deterrence. So this is going to be high frequency sounds just to deter the migrating bats from the turbine blades. Also using light or visual modifications, so things like low attraction lighting in order to try to prevent the bats from colliding with the blades. However, these solutions do require collaboration with kind of the wind energy companies, different researchers, and policymakers to make sure that bat populations are not severely affected. And importantly, make sure that wind turbines can consistently make energy. But it's something that people are currently working on in order to make sure that wind turbines can still operate because it is very important to have wind energy. But bat populations are not severely affected. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with bats living in the extreme cold. I did want to switch gears to talk about bats living in the extreme heat and the behavioral adaptations that they have, because I find it so cool and so fascinating. But first, I wanted to talk about a bat called the pallid bat. So this is a species that is found in Southwest North America. And this includes the Sonoran Desert as well. Now, they face very, very hot temperatures, and they have a few behavioral adaptations that they can use in order not to essentially die from the heat. But one thing that they can do is they can actually raise their body temperature in hot conditions. So in conditions of up to 40 degrees Celsius, they'll actually increase their body temperature above that like normal 37 degrees. And this is to prevent them from using kind of methods to cool down. So they'll just survive at the higher body temperatures. And this also ensures that they can save on any water too, so they're not losing water to the environment. However, there is a limit. Anything above 40 degrees, the bats must switch to different mechanisms in order to cool. So they'll do things like panting, salivating, or also licking their fur to cool down. These methods, though, cause bats to lose water to the environment, so they kind of have to be a little bit choosy when doing this, but they'll only do it at temperatures above 40 degrees. When they do these different behavioral kind of mechanisms to cool down, they can dissipate about 200% of their metabolic heat, so it is a very efficient way to kind of cool down. But another way that bats will, specifically the pallid bats, will keep cool is they'll choose their day roosts very specifically, and they'll choose rock crevices that kind of allow them to buffer from the extreme heat. So the rock crevices are a lot cooler. They'll hang out during the day in these rock crevices, and as the ambient temperature outside warms up, they're still able to maintain a very cooler body temperature. So usually about 30 degrees during the day, which is considerably cool. When their body temperature is about 30 degrees, they're also saving on energy and also water as well. So different adaptations that they can use, basically behavioral adaptations to make sure that you can stay cool during kind of very warm temperatures. Other bat species, so looking at the fish-eating bat, which occurs around the Gulf of California in Mexico, so here in red. This bat also faces very warm temperatures, but bats that face warm temperatures normally also face very dry environments too. And this is a bat that will feed from different fish and crustaceans from the ocean, but also can drink ocean water as well. And it's because they have modifications in their kidneys to highly concentrate the salt in their urine. So this allows them to drink the ocean water when fresh water is not available. So a very cool different physiological adaptation to allow bats to live in the extreme heat, but also in an arid environment as well. And then I did want to talk about the black flying fox in Australia as well. This is a species that will roost in trees. This is a species that is directly exposed to kind of the warm ambient temperatures. They don't have the benefit of being able to roost in cooler locations like rock crevices. And during periods of extreme heat in Australia, they'll use different behavioral adaptations like panting. So this is going to be rapid breathing to dissipate heat, very similar to a dog. They also will do saliva spreading. So this is licking the wings on the chest to spread saliva essentially to dissipate. So this is very similar to how humans would be sweating. Humans sweat and the water will evaporate, and that's how we're able to cool down. With bats spreading their saliva, they're spreading that saliva over their body. That saliva can evaporate, and that will cool the bats down. Bats in extreme heat, the black flying foxes will also seek different shade and move within the roost. This is just to find cooler locations. But they will also do wing fanning, which is essentially spreading their wings open for airflow. I found this cool video of different bats doing it. So this is both the gray-headed and black flying foxes. And so they're doing this wing fanning to kind of cool down their bodies essentially. So different behavioral adaptation. Now, in Australia, there is 4 mainland species. So we have species like the gray-headed flying fox, the spectacle flying fox, the black flying fox, which I just talked about, and then the little red flying fox. At present, the gray-headed flying fox is listed as vulnerable. Spectacle flying fox, unfortunately, is listed as endangered. With the black flying fox and the little red flying fox both listed as least concerned. However, their previous assessments are back from 2017 and 2016. Now, the range of these species is kind of to the north and to the east of Australia, with the spectacle flying fox kind of occurring at the very northern tip. And the reason why the range of these species is important is because of occurrences like the Australian Black Summer, which happened kind of from June 2019 to March 2020, which was this horrific massive fire and heat wave occurrence that happened. And factors that contributed to it was kind of exceptionally dry conditions. There was a severe lack of soil moisture. There were early fires in Queensland, and very specifically, very incredibly high temperatures. There was a range of temperatures kind of from the mid-30s all the way up to about 45 degrees. And what this led to was massive amounts of fires. About 240,000 square kilometers of land was lost in these fires, which is roughly equivalent to the land area of the entire United Kingdom. About 450 people were killed as a result of these fires, and also the smoke as well. And about 3 billion terrestrial vertebrates were killed in these fires as well, very unfortunately. But what this meant for the different flying foxes in Australia was a massive amount of die-offs. And so there was a study by Moe and colleagues that estimated these amount of die-offs as a result of these fires and these extreme temperatures. And so what they did is they went and collected a bunch of data on this. So this included direct counts of the carcasses, and also estimates of the numbers of carcasses just because there were so many. So what they did is they either laid bats in these kind of grid formats, and then within the grid, the bats were lying in rows of a set number, and they used multiplication essentially to estimate the amount of bats. But they used different estimates as well. And they also included numbers of bats taken into care. So this is from numbers from wildlife rehabs. And this was to essentially estimate the amount of die-offs during the Australian black summer. What they found, and this is a minimum estimate, is that about 2,600 flying foxes died as a pup abandonment. So instances like this, where the pups were abandoned by their mothers and the pups were no longer able to survive. So about 26 pups had died. And in total, about 72,000 flying foxes died during the heat wave, which is an astronomical amount. And I have to stress this is the minimum, not the maximum, but the minimum estimate of bats that had died during the Black Summer. This data was also limited to 40 different camps in Australia. 23 were only gray-headed flying foxes, and 17 camps were gray-headed and black flying foxes. So this doesn't estimate the total amount of camps, just 40 camps as well. So the number is enormously higher than what Moenel kind of estimated, which is very scary and very sad. And these numbers represent the largest die-off in a single summer of flying foxes, which is also very unfortunate because some of these species are listed as vulnerable or endangered. And this is something that is still continuing as well. This is not just a one-off. This is from this year, January of 2026, and flying foxes are still dying in mass mortality events brought on by these intense temperatures, essentially. And we do know that human-caused climate change is attributed to these increases in fires and extreme temperatures as well, very unfortunately. And I kind of just want to bring this back to this bat species richness map because climate change is something that is affecting the globe, and all bats across the world are going to be facing the consequences of climate change. Right now, we are experiencing these kind of increases in global temperatures. This is kind of a mean of the global temperature, but we are every year seeing these increases. And now we're into 2025, where we have about an estimated 1.19 increase in mean temperatures. But climate change is also heterogeneous. Some regions are experiencing more rapid warming compared to others. And the prevalence of heat waves are also increasing around the world as well. All bat species are going to be experiencing the effects of a warming climate and the adaptations that allow them to survive in their habitats, either the hibernation, migration, or any mechanisms that allow them to cool off aren't going to work in a hotter world. And this is going to push bats essentially past their thermal limits. Now, I don't want to leave on a note that is all doom and gloom, but I just want to highlight different organizations around the world that are working so hard on bat conservation. This slide is not all encompassing, but it does highlight the different numbers of organizations and also the number of people who dedicate their lives to bat conservation, discovering more about bats, and making sure that bats kind of can survive. And this is kind of in a world right now where very unfortunately headlines are continuously coming out about funding cuts for different research and conservation as well. But I do think it is important to talk about it and to focus on it and kind of spread the good word about bats as well and try to teach other people. So I do just kind of want to leave on that note as well. But thank you so much for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, Christina. That was an excellent talk and definitely gave like an excellent overview of not just it's very well known that bats can handle some extreme cold temperatures, but also to kind of get an
Yeah.
understanding of some of the extreme heat that they can both tolerate and not tolerate. So thank you so much for that. Uh, if you have a question, feel free, like we can open our cameras and microphones up now. We definitely have time for some questions here. So feel free to either ask away or you can put your questions into the chat and I can read them for you. Totally up to you. Um, but yeah, so I guess I will start it off. So when it comes to I come from like I've always worked in more like northern latitudes, and so I've definitely dealt more with the extreme cold. And I noticed on your on the maps of like where temperatures were going to be changing and everything, it looks like it is more focused on more northern latitudes. So, what sort of do you know of anything of like different adaptations, behavioral or physiological that bats are having at northern latitudes to help deal with extreme temperature changes? Because I know in Canada over the last couple of years, we've had these heat waves and heat domes that have moved across the continent essentially. So, yeah, do we know anything about how bats are handling heat in northern latitudes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And kind of my answer is there's not enough research, but also from what we know, it's not great because our climate is changing so rapidly that bats aren't able to adapt. Like adaptation takes tens of years, if not hundreds, to occur. And climate change is happening every year, essentially, with temperatures going up. So bats aren't able to change or to adapt as rapidly as we want or need as well. And there was just a study that went out about big brown bats, looking at how they can cope in bat boxes during heat waves, and
Mm.
the answer is that they can't. Like
Yeah.
even in the summer in bat boxes, it's just getting too hot for them to be able to survive, and it's past or pushing them past their thermal limit.
Yeah, that's that's
Um,
that's very, very there's more and more research that's coming out now about how we have like we bat biologists or researchers or rehabbers, as well as how we talk to people about promoting putting up bat houses, because that's one of like the best ways that we like, oh, you want to like help bats, put up a bat house. But now we have to have all of these caveats because of exactly that. They can turn into ovens if they're not placed
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat. What can be done? What can be done to counter for dehydration resulting from heat?
That's a good question. I know. So, bats, that's a really good question. But bats will use torpor, um, in periods of extreme temperatures. And using torpor reduces the amount of water that they lose, but they have to find a cool enough location to enter torpor as well. So if everywhere is hot,
Mm.
because of climate change and a kind of a because of a warming global temperatures, um, it's still going to be hard for bats to kind of combat that. Looking at the flying foxes, though, during heat waves, though, there is research right now into installing like sprinklers into bat camps in order to try to like cool them down and prevent them from losing water too. And there is some like moderate success with that research, but it's going to be hard to kind of employ. And especially looking at like the government Australia as well, kind of have to push policymakers to um, implement that.
We have another question in the chat, and Christina, if you can't answer this, then I could. Is there any action aiming towards treatment of white nose syndrome in Canadian populations?
There is Corey Lawson with her
Yeah.
probiotic treatment is looking at it. She's also had some moderate success with that. But a big challenge with kind of implementing treatments too is knowing where bats hibernate.
Mhm.
So research is still needed into knowing where bats are. just because bats are so incredibly widespread throughout Canada and the entire world that we don't even know where they hibernate. So kind of step one is also finding the bats, and then step two is being able to implement the treatments as well.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any more questions? Either you can raise your hand, turn on your camera, or put it in the chat. Okay, so we have, are bats shifting their ranges at all with increasing climate change?
From what I know, they are kind of going more northwards, but I do also know that the hibernators are changing their phrenology, so changing when they go into hibernation and also changing when they're exiting hibernation as well. There was some research out of Europe looking at two different species, and they found a noticeable change because of climate change that bats were exiting hibernation earlier because winter was ending earlier as well. But with the ranges, from what I know, they are going more northwards, but they are also impacted by insect availability as well. So if there's no insects, they're
Mhm.
also not going to go more northwards as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, if we don't, those are some excellent questions. So thank you everyone for asking some great questions. And thank you, Kristina, for answering some great questions and for a wonderful presentation. So again, we can wrap it up for today. If we don't, unless someone else has a question, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I'll start kind of doing my closing announcements. So if there's something that Kristina talked about today that you would like to reference again, this is going to be posted up on the YouTube channel for GBATnet by the end of the day, and we will also have resources available on our website. So you can always refer back to the material again. And otherwise, we can go ahead and finish up for the day. So, again, thank you everyone for coming and joining us today from all over the place, which is one of the great things about these webinars. And so, thank you everyone for tuning in from all over. And thank you so much, Kristina, for being our speaker today and talking to us about the thermal limits of bats. So, without further ado, go ahead and we can sign off for today, and everyone have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, or have a wonderful sleep.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.